This lecture is based on work I've been doing over the past dozen years on the final volume of the Corpus Signorum Imperii Romani for Great Britain, known to its friends as CSIR. What is CSIR? It's an international project to catalogue all the decorated stonework from the Roman Empire. Any stone that has been carved with motifs of any sort, whether an altar, statue, relief, architectural embellishment, tombstone or graffiti, is in CSIR. Mere inscriptions don't make it in unless they have a decorative border. Now, my area is the hinterland of Hadrian's wall, south of the Staingate. That includes the southwest tip of Northumberland, sites in Tyne and Wear not included in CSIR 1.1, places in County Durham, Cumbria, Lancashire, and Derbyshire, because Derbyshire got forgotten when they were doing all the others. The geographical region covered is about 6,000 square miles, which includes some of the worst roads in England. I don't know if any of you know the lower road to Milham, but it's unnecessarily exciting in my opinion. And also this area includes a number of areas not well known to me before the project began. And I shall start by saying extraordinary kindness has been shown by those who've used their local knowledge to draw attention to stones which might have escaped notice, arranged access to private properties, and tracked down references in obscure texts on their personal bookshelves. Throughout the research, and especially for the Analysing Britain's Most Elusive Roman Sculptures project, of which more anon, this local knowledge has been invaluable, as some of the sculptures were indeed elusive and required team efforts to track them down. My gratitude is due to the many landowners, householders, museum curators and church wardens for their unfailing kindness in allowing access, providing ladders, keeping me up the ladders, offering refreshments and showing interest in the work in hand. Now, during this project, several new pieces of Romano-British sculpture have been discovered, and some long lost have been refound. Many of the stones have curious histories and even folk legends about them. Others fill gaps in our knowledge about the Romans in the north of England and offer evidence about religious practice in the military zone at this time. And I'd like to start with some new finds. At one point, I thought I needed to go to the Church of St. Bridget at Bridekirk, just to the south of Maryport. According to the Anglo-Saxon corpus, there was a piece of barley sugar twist sitting on a windowsill that the authors of that particular volume of the corpus weren't sure was Roman or Anglo-Saxon. So I thought I'd better go and just check it out. This was just after lockdowns, when you had to have church wardens opening the church specially for you in order to be able to get in. This led to an awful lot of tea and cake. It's a good thing we didn't have that before, because I would have been twice the size I am now. But having been let into this church and found the piece of barley sugar twist, I turned round and let out what can only be described as a yelp, because that's what I found sitting on the windowsill opposite the barley sugar twist. Now, this shows a very handsome Genius. Here is the Genius with a mural crown, splendid ringlets, holding a cornucopia, and with this sort of tree by the side. Now, horticulturally, I wouldn't try to say which sort of tree that is, but the church wardens realised that I was quite excited about this, and they rushed off and got a feather duster and gave it a very vigorous dusting, which meant that all my photographs had dust motes in it, and I had to send somebody back in under cover of darkness to rephotograph it. This is not in the historic environment record for Cumbria. When I asked the county archaeologist about it, he scurried around and he said there is a handwritten note about it being found in the ruins of the old church in 1912, but nobody's actually ever been to see it and check it out. So this is completely new. Now, when you're trying to get funding for various aspects of a project, and in this particular case, the elusive sculptures part of it, you have to write a methodology statement. I became aware that my methodology statement was probably not as far-reaching as it should be, because I was sitting next to Bill Shannon at the formal dinner at the end of the 2019 pilgrimage, and he asked me how I was getting on with CSIR, and he said, "You do know about the Whalley warrior, don't you?" And I said, "What Whalley warrior?" And he pointed out that he had actually written about the Whalley warrior, but he'd never published it. And basically that is the Whalley warrior, which is a very handsome thing when you think about it. I mean, he's got plumes on his helmet. He's got this lovely round shield with a boss here. He may be wearing a muscled cuirass. It's difficult to know. He's certainly got a cloak. This is his sword, and you can actually see the shape at the bottom. And when you're there, you can just see cross straps here. And in fact, there are straps coming down, zigzagging down there of the scabbard. On his other side, he has a bird-headed dagger and this pilum. And over here, he has a column with a capital on the top. Now, this is a photograph. We went to see it, to scan it. We scanned it, but at the time, the light was really bad, and we saw that side. But the church is really interesting, and when I was coming back from the RAI visit to Anglesey last year, I called in to see the place again, and the light was different, and I found another tree on the side, very, very similar to the one at Bridekirk, which is not that far away. Now, several puzzles have come to light which have required serious detective work and lateral thinking to solve. One such puzzle is the Genius from Lanchester in County Durham, the puzzle being just how many reliefs of genii were there from Lanchester. Hodgson in 1807 described what he called an altar carved on one face with the figure of a priest pouring a libation upon an altar preparatory to a sacrifice. He goes on to say he has a torch in his left hand, in his right a bottle, and on each side of the altar is represented the rude figure of a lamb. This, he said, was at the time in the garden of Mary Brown in Lanchester, which is 27 Front Street, if the inscription Mary and Sarah Brown 1788 over the front door is any clue. Now, the torch is more likely to be a cornucopia, suggesting this was a Genius, but as it wasn't illustrated, we only have Hodgson's description to go by, and I was a bit perplexed by the bottle. However, also recorded as coming from Lanchester, but now in Chester's Museum on Hadrian's Wall, is this relief of a definite Genius. In the 19th century, this was known to be at various times at Axwell Park and Greencroft, the two homes of the Clavering family. It was then presented by Sir William Aloysius Clavering, and I should warn you, there's some wonderful names coming through this. He was a baronet, and he gave it to the antiquarian John Clayton of Chester's. As you can see, it's been very well carved. You've got all the musculature down his tummy and face there. He has a piece of cloth hanging on rather loosely around his... I'm not sure that was going to stay there very long. He's wearing these wonderful furry top boots. And he has a bracelet or armilla on this arm here. He holds a cornucopia, lovely curly hair, and he appears to be pouring a libation from a handleless patra onto this altar, which even has bolsters. You can see there, it's a lovely thing. Now, in 1883, Lucas quotes a letter from Dr. Christopher Hunter to Roger Gale, written on May the 17th, 1735, in which Hunter refers to a figure of Ceres being transferred to James Clavering's house in Greencroft. He describes the figure as well cut, one hand leading upon a globe, which Hunter took to be a lapis malaris, a quernstone, basically. Again, there is no illustration. Now, the only sculptured stone known to have been at Greencroft is this relief of Agenius at Chester's Museum, although there's no globe, nothing you could describe as a globe there. And the globe may suggest that what he was talking about is this rather battered-looking thing, which certainly is Agenius. Again, he's got a sort of towel around him, a cornucopia, a rather grumpy face, and he's pouring a libation on an altar, which appears to be sitting on a globe. Now, this was originally in the Greenwell collection and is now in the Society of Antiquaries of Newcastle upon Tyne's collection. Now, this is a very crude relief, so crude it defies qualification as Hunter's well-cut figure. In his left hand, he holds a cornucopia containing 6 round fruit against his left shoulder. It's a very crude copy, but it seems to be a very crude copy not of the one at Chester's, but of this one here, which is also from Lanchester. But at least we know that this particular one was not one of the stones we've discussed so far. It was built into the vestry wall of All Saints Parish Church, Lanchester, before being absorbed into the Greenwell collection. I use the word absorb because Canon Greenwell had a tendency to go along and tell people to chip things out of churches in the 19th century. But that is now in the Society of Antiquaries collection, Newcastle again. Now, I've come to the conclusion that the last 2 stones are not the ones referred to by either Hunter or Hodgson, But both those learned gentlemen were referring to the one that ended up at Chester's, this one here. So William Aloysius Clavering, having tidied up the stone before presenting it to John Clayton by cutting off the fragmentary rude figures of lambs on the side. Certainly, if you look at this, I mean, unfortunately, the photograph doesn't show that side very clearly, but if you look at this one on the left-hand side, that is far too neat to be a Roman edge. And I think basically he's tidied it up before giving it as a present. So I think we have 3 definite genii from Lanchester in captivity, and I don't think there are any missing, and there never was a relief of Ceres. According to some reports, this relief of a hunter god was found in the restorations of Gainford Church in County Durham in 1864-5, although some references indicate it was found earlier. And just to confuse matters, the 1806 edition of Camden says it was found at Binchester. Hilary Coole and David Mason, who have done the most recent research on Piercebridge, are confident it was originally from Piercebridge. As you can see, it's a male figure facing front, wearing a tunic with a ruffled hem on the bottom there, and also a ruffled part round his waist. His tunic has short sleeves with loose folds of drapery across his chest. In his right hand, he holds a hare by its hind legs, and you can just see the hare's ears at the bottom here and his tail there. Between the man's shoulder and the column border, there's the head of a horse, and you can see the bridle and head straps there. Up here, there's a column which has a zigzag design on its capital. Now, it's presumed that Richardson's description of a figure walking to its left, also with a hare, refers to this stone. Mr. Surtees' drawing, used by both Richardson in 1843 and Hutchinson 1794, shows a mirror image of a similar figure with more loosely swathed clothing rather than a tunic, nape-length hair flicked up at the ends, a fringe and a beard. However, the beard must be doubtful, as Richardson describes the figure as called a fawn by Mr. Cade, by others conjectured to be a Diana Venatrix. Hutchinson, following Richardson, identified the cross-strap as a sling and the figure as a slinger. So have we 1 or 2 hunter gods, one from Binchester and one from Piercebridge? I have concluded we have only one relief, and that originally came from Piercebridge. And this is basically, the printer got it wrong, and I suspect it was drawn from a description rather than the person actually seeing it. The hair is there, but it's upside down. Now, the scene bears a noticeable resemblance to one on a jasper intaglio from South Shields, which depicts a huntsman, interpreted as Silvanus Cercidius, holding a hare in his right hand and a hunting stick, that's that squiggly thing here, in his left. He wears what you might call an off-the-shoulder tunic, belted at the waist in a similar fashion to the figure depicted by Surtees. Now, another example where it's not clear if there were 1 or 2 items is the matter of the raven glass Venus. Now, this was wedged in the arch of a water feature in the garden of a 19th century villa at Ravenglass when I first saw it. It has since been removed by the landowner to Lanchester Castle. And I should say that I'm very grateful to him for taking a chainsaw to the greenery round it so I could actually get at this thing. The lady is naked, although a whispered drapery passes behind her back and across her left hip and stomach below her very shapely waist. There are tresses of hair over her right shoulder. You can see the hair coming down here, bits of drapery coming round here. A ridge across her upper chest, as one might describe it here, could be a torque, or it could be more hair or more drapery. There's no detail at the back of the statue other than the curved line of her back, suggesting it was originally displayed in a niche. Now, statues of Venus in the round are rare in Roman Britain, but this bears a similarity to the figure of Venus from Rochester, who also has tresses of hair, the torso from Hinksworth in Herefordshire, and a statue from Dover. There is the possibility, however, that this is the missing Venus from Maryport, as drawn by Hutchinson. The size is similar, as is the stance and the nipped-in waist. However, Hutchinson's drawing that you see here of 1794 doesn't show any indication of drapery or hair tresses, but he may just not have noticed them. Another puzzle is this thing here, which, according to Gough in 1789, was found, and I quote, at the end of Mr. Guy's house at Watercrook, Cumbria, and it was known in the early 18th century. In 1776, Stukely reported that, and I quote, the gavel end, by which he means the gable end, fell down some time ago and knocked off his head and arms. The naked figure seems to be quite young and portly, with shorty stumpy legs, a small pot belly, and a small phallus. The figure has his right hand on a column, which may be an altar or the remains of a tree stump. And on his other hand is a leaping animal. Here you've got the forepaws leaping up against his chest. Now, Gale thought the figure to be a Cupid or Genius, while West, in 1780, referred to it as Silenus. The suggestion that it might be yet another Genius appeared to be supported by Horsley's comment that the crown shown in his plate 60, which is this thing here, which looks remarkably Hollywood, this is the portly person that we were talking about, was in the memory of an aged person yet living placed upon the head of the image, that is this figure, though it is now by some unhappy accident broken off and the rest of the image lost. Now this would suggest that the portly person had a head which was not illustrated and only mentioned in the early reports as having fallen victim to the collapsing gable end. Unfortunately for the identification of Agenius sacrificing, the evidence that the two pieces were associated is sketchy at best, and sadly the crown is now missing, so I can't compare it as to size, as to geology, whether it's three-dimensional, two-dimensional. If I just go back though, you'll notice this leaping animal, which wasn't noticed by anybody else before. And this may suggest a hunting god, but is more likely to indicate Bacchus. Of the few complete depictions of Bacchus as a separate figure in Roman Britain, the most similar in pose is a statuette from Spoonley Wood, Gloucestershire, where Bacchus rests his left arm on a tree stump, while a panther stands by his right foot. An altar from the temple of Sulis Minerva at Bath is carved on one side with a male figure, tentatively identified as Bacchus, pouring a libation with a leopard at his feet. We have 3D scanned some stones in a British Academy and Leverhulme funded project called Analysing Britain's Most Elusive Roman Sculptures. Reviewers of previous CSRs have invariably complained about the quality of some of the photographs, not perhaps being aware that one is rarely photographing these stones in the best circumstances. I have often had to move wedding flowers or harvest festival material, or at Whalley, reorganise the children's corner. Some of the stones are out of doors where one has absolutely no control over the lighting conditions. Sometimes they are displayed in museums in such a way as to make it hard to get a decent aim, as at Lanchester Museum, where there's my colleague John Allison teetering on a stepladder, trying not to crack his head open on the reconstruction of a Roman roof here, whilst aiming at this lady standing really out of reach. And here at Ribchester Museum, here is the team. There's John Allison, Professor Ian Haynes, Ian's daughter, and this is Alex Turner. Now, the problem with this stone here, which is on loan to Ribchester Museum from Cambridge University, is that you've got here Apollo with his lyre, etc., but on this side here are the figures of two women, and you cannot get far enough back to photograph those. So we use this thing, which looks a bit like a hairdryer. We do feel that the amount of these things cost, they could look a bit more impressive, but they invariably look like an iron or a hairdryer. On this occasion, certainly, the scanning worked, because here you can see now, for the first time for a very long time, you have a decent view of these two women standing in joined arches. Who they are is a whole lecture in itself. Using scanning, we were also able to have a go at this poor stone, which is at Maryport. It stands in a corner, teetering on these two blocks. It's the only stone from Maryport that has anything on the sides of the shaft. There's a patra, different sort of patra on both sides, but on the back there is a wheel, and that's why they have the mirror behind. But you can't really see it, you can't photograph it. Nobody thought to photograph the beastly thing before they put it in that position. Ian Haynes went, and although he nearly got his head trapped in this railing here, he was able to get that scan, and I think all the money that was spent on this 3D scanning, this particular stone makes it all worthwhile. Sometimes scanning has revealed details that were not otherwise visible, as on this small altar from Chester Street. This is the photograph and not the scan. A letter dated May the 20th, 1852, John Bell told Charles Roach Smith of the discovery of 4 small altars from Chester Street. He commented that the 3 small altars were found together on the 12th of February 1849 in a piece of ground added to the churchyard as an addition to the burial ground and the fourth was found in the wall of a house near there too, which was rebuilt in 1850. The sexton who found the first told the Reverend Fanshawe, spelt Featherstonehoff, that they were found amongst rubbish as if thrown out in a barrow. The other two stones found with this one are dedicated to the Deities. The fourth is dedicated to Apollo. Now, this is not very exciting to look at, and I should say that anything which went through Durham Cathedral has this white or red, they did it twice, damn them, stenciling of the accession number on top of it. And they always did it on the inscription. What they were thinking, I do not know. But it makes it very difficult to read. And in RIB, this is, you can see the DEO to the god, DI, and Collingwood thought he could see a G under there. So this was regarded as the god Dig, much beloved of all archaeologists. However, the scanning showed that this was not a G at all, and in fact it's more likely to be to the gods and goddesses. The letters BANNAI are also indistinct, but actually do show up far better in the scan, but it's not possible to say with certainty if this refers to the fort at Oswald. Shaft on the left side has at least one register of chip-carved triangles, whilst that on the right has a raised boss with a roughly cut frame, which may be intended to represent a patra. There's a lot going on, and it's less than a foot high. In 1974, Joyce Cooley was of the opinion that this was a product of a postulated stonemason's workshop at Chesley Street or Lanchester. Now, sometimes the stones I've included, and I should point out there are 500 stones in this volume, and there were 200 plus that I rejected as not being decorated or not even being Roman. And sometimes they've taken a bit of finding. There's a lovely church called St Mungo's at Dearham, just the south of Maryport. And there was a reference from Watkin in the 19th century, who used to publish an archaeological journal every year, a rundown on all the inscriptions and altars found in Britain. And he mentions in passing that the Reverend Hupel had told him that at Dearham Church, St Mungo's Church, Dearham, there was part of an altar dedicated to the mother goddesses, to the Matres, which in local legend had once supported the font. So I went to Dearham Church, and when I walked in, I found that. And I thought, well, that's not Roman, that's Romanesque. And the base at the bottom was not part of a Roman altar. It certainly didn't have the word Matres written on it. And so I thought, this is very odd, because this altar with Matres on it is not in RIB at all. But when I went away and I thought, well, the Reverend Hupel knew what he was doing. He was a vicar in the Diocese of Durham, so he knew his Romanesque. He also was the excavator of South Shields Roman fort and Winchester Roman fort, so he knew his Roman. He knew the difference between Romanesque and Roman. So I contacted Bruce Bennison, who had been county archaeologist for Cumbria, and asked him if he knew anything about it. And he came across another reference which proved that this thing did actually exist. So I wrote to the vicar, a very nice lady, who said she hadn't been there very long and she didn't know anything about it, but she sensibly passed it on to a church warden who said, yeah, you pass it every day. It's built into the wall of the vestry inside. He said it was hidden for some years behind a very large bookcase. So John Alice and I played hooky from the 2019 pilgrimage, and we went in, and there it is. It's not the most exciting thing. It does have some very nice twisty feet up here. And if you play around with the scanning, this one, you can see the tops of the serifs along the top there. And it says Matres. So Hupel is vindicated. And that is now in Britannia. What I found increasingly fascinating as I've researched pieces of sculpture, however, is not just finding new pieces, solving the puzzles of old pieces, or even disagreeing with the interpretations of my predecessors, but some of the stories that have emerged about subsequent histories of the stones. This is known in trendy archaeological circles as the biography of the artifacts, and these stories tell us much about the ways of thinking of our predecessors, as well as shedding much light on life in the 18th and 19th century. An example of this is an altar to Hercules, which was found in 1803 near the northeast corner of the fort at Whitley Castle, Northumberland. With it were found fragments of a statue, of which it was reported in 1814 that, and I quote, head and body were broken to pieces and digging up, and the feet only with the hand were preserved and taken to London, where they were in the possession of a private gentleman. The hand with its club was exhibited at the Society of Antiquaries of London on the 18th of June, 1812. The head was still at Whitley Castle Farm in 1924, where it was sketched by Sopwith, not his finest work, I suspect. It was loaned to the Society of Antiquaries of Newcastle in 1928 and returned to the lender by 1956 and hasn't been seen since. Now, the hand was grasping a club, suggesting a statue, and Bosanquet thought he'd photographed the altar that I'm talking about, the Hercules altar, during a Sant outing to Whitley Castle in 1925, when he stated that the mutilated head seen resting on the focus of the altar in the photograph seems to be the head of Hercules found with the altar. Unfortunately, this is not the right altar. This is the altar to Apollo Citharoedus. And it is that one which is in the Great North Museum. And you've got all sorts of things going on there, which again is a lecture in itself. Now, the real Hercules altar developed a curiously wandering habit. We're talking about something that stands about so high. So it's heavy. And it took me some time to pursue it. Initially, it was kept at an alehouse near the fort. In 1812, it was purchased for £7 by an anonymous buyer and taken to London. It was then sold at least twice, once for £15, before being sold to Sir Geoffrey Page Turner for £80. Now, I should say here that I was distracted by the name Sir Geoffrey Page Turner, and I looked into this and discovered that he had started out as plain Turner, but there was an inheritance due, and so he added the name Page. The Page Turners apparently are still a very distinguished family who seem to have had a sense of humour forced upon them in the 19th century. Anyway, following this Hercules altar, in 1936 it was in the possession of a Mr. J.L. Higgins of Turvey Abbey, Bedfordshire, whose family had bought it at the sale of the effects of Sir Gregory Page Turner of Battleston. It was donated to the Bedford Modern School by Mr. and Mrs. Rupert Allen, who bought Turvey Abbey in 1955, and they in turn lent it to the Cecil Higgins Art Gallery Museum, where I finally bagged it a few years ago. Now, called an altar, this may in truth be a statue pedestal with a socket in the capital rather than a focus. Bosanquet described this as a sinking. It measures only 220 by 160 millimetres with a depth of 15 millimetres, so it wouldn't really have acted well as a socket for a statue. It also has sloping sides. It is possible, of course, it was amended later in its history, for it has had quite a history. It's been running around the country all over the place. On the left side is the figure of a robust naked infant Hercules strangling two serpents. If ever a child needed firmer parenting, I think that's probably it. The right side depicts Hercules and the Hydra in the garden of Hesperides. And here we have a naked adult Hercules holding a club against his left shoulder with his right hand, ready to beat up those nasty serpents. The inscription translates as to the god Hercules, Gaius Vitellius, Aticianus, centurion of the 6th Legion Victrix, Pia Fidelis set this up. So this is definitely the one that was found with the head and the hand. Some pieces, such as the relief of the Genius from Lanchester that ended up at Chester's, seem to have been taken as gifts when their owners visited friends or relatives, in the same way that we today would take a bunch of flowers, a box of chocolates, or a bottle of wine. I do sometimes wonder what their recipients made of these gifts and why those proudly presenting them felt it was worth the trouble of transporting some very heavy items. Perhaps they're only too glad to be shot of them. Some of the items that moved about are RIBH14. This is a big altar. It was found at Maryport in the 17th century and taken to the library of the Bishop of the Isle of Man between 1726 and 1731 as a wedding present, though I'm sure they would have preferred a silver teapot. However, it doesn't seem to have stayed there forever because it's a big thing to have lurking about the house. And it was given to Tully House in 1907 and is now on loan to the Sen House Museum at Maryport. Another very large altar is this one, RIB 831, also found at Maryport. Very fine piece of sculpture, much a proof of the very clear inscription down here. That was given to Mussolini in 1935 by Guy Senhouse. I think a fairly solid indication of his political views. Now, some have been difficult to track down. Others have just been thought missing, but actually staring us in the face all the time. This one Reportedly found in 1852 on the north bank of the River Derwent, half a mile from Workington at Barrow Walls. However, a loose sketch of the stone interleaved in Bruce's annotated copy of the second edition of the Roman wall at Palace Green Library, Durham University, records it was found built into the wall of the old church at Moresby and was in the mid-19th century standing under the remains of the chancel arch before being taken to Lowther Castle. So here we've got another moving one. This took some tracking down and was only finally nabbed last December. It was part of the Lowther Castle collection, and it was long thought that it went to the British Museum when the Lowther Castle collection was sold at auction in 1969. Even the British Museum thought they had it and was somewhat concerned that they couldn't find it. It turns out, however, that it became separated from the rest of the Romano-British items and sold a year later via different auctioneers, escaping the eye of the British Museum. At that sale, it went under the hammer with another fragment of stone for the grand sum of £2. The person who bought the two pieces placed them in his mother's garden in Tew in Hertfordshire. His mother at some stage gave the second fragment away, and no one in the family can recall to whom it was given or what it looked like, other than it had a sort of swag on it. So sadly, that has not made it into CSIR, because I think a sort of swag doesn't really do it. When the house at Tew was sold in 1980, this stone was relocated to a garden in Oxfordshire, where it has remained ever since, chuckling to itself as both British and Italian archaeologists have scoured the country for it. I finally tracked it down when Tim Padley gave me the contact details of an Italian scholar who had spent some time in Cumbria years ago working on the Grand Tour collection, which mostly made up the Lowther Castle material. Now, this Italian scholar had had sight of a sales catalogue in a library in Rome, which had a name penciled next to the lot number. Luckily, the name was unusual and was the same as that of somebody I'd met about 20 years ago. I tracked him down to see if he knew anything about this altar, see if it's one of his family members, and he said, "Yes, it's sitting in my garden. Do you want a photograph?" It is an unusual piece. On the left side of the shaft is the figure of a goddess wearing a stola with a stiff overfold, as you can see up here. There is a suggestion of a Gorgonian on her chest. Her feet project forward over the top of the altar-shaped pedestal on which she is standing, indicating this is the depiction of a statue. She holds a shaft in her right hand and rests her rectangular shield on a small globe with her left hand. The sheathing around the edge of the shield, which I think you can see here, and the boss are quite clear. On the right side, which is slightly more battered, is the figure of a nude male on a plain pedestal. So this is clearly another statue, although he may be standing on a boulder. A wide vertical rib up this side may suggest he's holding a club or is standing by a tree. To his left, there is a rectangular shape which may indicate a cloak or a shield. It is inscribed, "And for their children Aurelius Secundus," which is an unusual inscription for an altar and has led to the notion that it may be a family tombstone. However, it is more convincing as an altar. The female figure may be Minerva, particularly if the curved shape on her chest represents the lower section of a Gorgonian. The male figure is usually described as Hercules, but the object to his right, this thing here, lacks the form and knobbly texture that usually indicates Hercules' club. An alternative interpretation may be Mercury, as it bears some resemblance to a Mercury from Corbridge, but it also bears resemblance to just about any other male deity that we've got in Roman Britain. This little thing also involved a major hunt. It was found immediately outside the ramparts of the southwest corner of Beckford Fort in Cumbria before June 1880. The site is also referred to as Mowbray and Mowbray, so that didn't help either. The problem with finding this was that it was described in so many different ways, so it wasn't clear what I was looking for. Robinson in 1881 implied it was a freestanding statue and said it was headless, but he may have confused it with a figure or tombstone from the same site. When first it was found, it was identified as Mithras, but Charles Roach Smith, in correspondence with Robinson, offered the suggestion that it was Diana in the guise of Luna Lucifera. A pediment from Bath depicting Luna Silene wearing a hair piled on top in a manner that resembles two knobs may offer a parallel. Wright and Phillips, however, are of the opinion the stone depicted a male god of hunting. Once found, it is clearly the stone described by Haverfield as the top of a small red freestone altar. This is a scan, so it doesn't show the colour quite well, but it is a good Penrith red sandstone. Haverfield went on to say, the top is square and flat and has a deep incised line running around near the edge. The sides have a moulding near the top and sunk panels below. On the front is carved the head and bust of a deity with a curious wig-like headdress with two upright projecting points, the extremities of which are bulbous. So it's clearly this one he's talking about. As you will have realised, scholars have differed in their opinion as to whether this represents a male or female deity, making locating it very tricky. But I finally ran it to ground in an unlabelled box in Tully House Museum when I was seeking something else. It is possible that the deity is Mercury, although he is usually depicted naked but for a cloak. A relief from Staunton on Arrow, Hereford, and another from Embleton in Buckinghamshire both show him wearing a tunic, which is what this zigzaggy pattern on the front may be. We also have a number of stones that have developed legends and folk stories about them. A possible relief of Priapus from Binchester in County Durham is a case in point. Mentioned by John Cade in a letter to Dr. Kay, Dean of Lincoln, as having been seen by Mr. Gill on the 5th of August 1754, and I quote, by the side of the way leading up the hill towards Mr. Wren's house. In 1794, it was in the possession of Farmer Wren Esquire, the proprietor of the station, by which he means Binchester Fort. When Hutchinson saw it, it had been used as a weight for a cheese press, but he said it had recently been rejected from a notion that ill luck attended its use and that cheese pressed by it was spoiled. No illustration survives, and I haven't been able to track it down, but according to Cade's letter, it was a stone consisting of 6 sides, nearly square, on one side a bold figure of Priapus in basso reliefo. One of the sides slopes to a narrow square at the top where a hole is cut as a mortise to receive the foot or stem of some statue. So it's been quite an impressive thing. I just wish I knew where it was. Was it Priapus? Priapus is not commonly shown on sculpture in Britain, but there is a relief from Scotland, possibly from Birrens, that appears to be inscribed with his name. The stones from Binchester have had a sad life. This might be described as the one that got away. It was found just after 1858 and dedicated to Fortuna. It was referred to by Bruce as having been saved at the pit's mouth by Dr. Rain. That is, it did not share the fate of many Binchester stones, being used to support pit props in a coal mine. We reckon we know where this pit is, but given that the stones were used to support the pit props, which are probably well rotted by now, we have balked at the health and safety issues of going down the pit to check them out, although there are some local potholers who would love to do so. Now, when it comes to the county of Derby, it might be said that the whole county had got away. When I was asked if I would include Derbyshire, I wrote to the county archaeologist and to members of the Derbyshire Archaeological Society and said, could you let me have information about any Roman sculpture found in Derbyshire? And to a man and a woman, they wrote back and said there isn't any. There was a relief of Apollo found in the 18th century, but nobody's seen it since, and that's the lot. Now, a few years after I wrote this letter, I was asked to go and give a talk to the Derbyshire Archaeological Society, and I started off by saying I was now going to talk for 3/4 of an hour on a topic that nobody in the room believed existed. And the lights went down, and as I gave the talk, I kept hearing these groans coming from the audience as they realised that they had got Roman sculpture in Derbyshire. It had been staring in the face, and they'd all been ignoring it. For example, that. That is the altar to Mars Brachyarcha at Haddon Hall. Now, you're having those nervous giggles that they had at the Archaeological Society in Derbyshire. There is considerable discrepancy in the publications as to the size of this altar. License in 1816 recorded as 2 foot 11 inches high. Watkin in 1885 says Mr. Slay measured it for him and found it to be 3 foot 10 in height. The reliquary was more accurate in stating it was 4 foot high. The discrepancies may suggest that this altar was being confused with another smaller altar to Mars, now missing but mentioned by Haverfield in 1905. This is the only inscription from Britain in which Brachyarcha is mentioned, whether syncretized with Mars or as a separate deity. Brachyarcha was a Celtic deity associated with wheat and malt and is closer to the Roman deity of Bacchus. Linking him with Mars is otherwise unattested and inexplicable, as is also the fact that Brachyarcha in Latin can be translated as underpants. So I don't know what's going on there. The second example for which there was a groan that came out of the audience is that. which is a relief of Mercury, which is on display in Derby Museum, which came from Little Chester's. I don't think we need to say anything about that. It's a perfectly good Mercury. There's his horns on his helmet, his wings, and then his purse down there. Now we finally come to the scandalous trough in the title of this paper, which is in the church of St John the Evangelist at the Lund, Kirkham, west of Preston in Lancashire. I'd already been to see this and photographed it, and here you can see that it has a very interesting and unusual oval focus, and you can see that it has been used, and it still is used, as a font. There is sculpture on the front and both sides. On the sides it's quite worn, and I felt that this probably would deserve being scanned to see if we can get something clearer. So I'd gone back with a scanning team when the very kind churchwardens of the church drew attention to an entry they had found in the records of the parish vestry for 1701. During lockdown, they'd spent time going through the parish records. In the records, it is stated, and I quote, that Matt Hall, churchwarden of Kirkham in 1688, set up a scandalous trough for a font in Lund. Now, wouldn't you have just loved to be zooming in on that particular parish council meeting? So why was this innocent-looking cube of stone considered so scandalous? The back is trim flat, but on the other wide face here is a clear view, this is a scan, there are 3 figures, presumably female, each wearing an ankle-length, possibly short-sleeved tunic. The foreshortened figures, the height of their hemlines, and the placing of their hands suggest they are seated. None of the hairstyles are clear enough to be identified, but the central figure and the one to the right appear to have their hair piled high on top of their head, leaving the neck clear. All 3 figures hold their hands in front of them as if holding an attribute, and their feet are perched on a wavy rib resembling a tree bough, but possibly intended to indicate the ground surface sloping down to the right. So far, this looks perfectly respectable, if a bit reminiscent of 3 sparrows on a twig. It is on the narrow sides of the shaft that the tone may lower, as each shows 3 dancing female figures, possibly nymphs, but equally possibly worshippers in a ritual dance, each holding their hands above their heads as if they're dancing the eightsome reel. Their drapery flows as if wind-blown, and their lower legs are naked. There is space below the figures on all the sides that could have held painted inscriptions, but in their absence we can only guess who these women were. David Breeze identifies the more sedentary of the scenes as mother goddesses, and I don't think there is much to quibble about there. It is the dancing girls that cause the problems, clearly in the 17th century as well as today. Their poses can be compared to the Maenads on the Milden Hall platter. Look at these ladies at the bottom here, this one here and this one here. The way that the drapery flows around their legs is very reminiscent of the scandalous trough. The figures on the Wiltshire example, which shows the 3 fates on a relief, are more static than the females on this altar and holding the symbols of the parquet or fates. Now the fates are as well as being depicted standing, can also be shown seated on continental altars, such as from Holstenstadt, Germany. But there, each figure is holding her usual attribute, and there's no attributes being clearly seen on our altar. Martin Haig has pointed out that the parquet and the matres may have been occasionally assimilated into one deity, and cites in evidence the altar from Skinburness in Cumbria, not very far from where this one was found, and another from Carlisle, so that all 3 in a fairly tight geographical part of northwest England. However, Martin also offers the suggestion that the 3 dancing figures on the Lund altar may represent the triple Hecate or the Charities, but this is less convincing as the central column or Hecateion of Hecate is not included in either scene. The altar was found near the line of the Ribchester to Kirkham road at Lund and presumed to have come from the fort at Kirkham, although David Breeze thought we should not dismiss the possibility of a rural shrine too readily. But I'm still left with the question, a shrine to who? Mother goddesses and dancing females do not usually appear on the same altar. The text for CSIR 1.11 is now in the production stage, and I hope tonight's talk has given you a flavour of what is included. When I was asked to tackle this project, I was assured there probably wasn't very much. As it was, there are 500 pieces that have made their way into the text. Even more, over 200, were tracked down and seen and then discarded. Some stones only got the most terse mention in the historic tests, so terse that one could not include them in any category or even be sure they were really Roman. If anyone knows what happened to the representation of Silvanus or the representation of Janus from Moss Hill, Farnham in Cumbria, which were said to be in perfect condition in the 1880s, but which were not described nor illustrated, which haven't been seen since. So if you know where they are, I'd like to know. Or the bust of Apollo, which was the only thing that Derbyshire admitted to having, which came from Brough-on-Noe, last seen in 1761 by Dr. Pegg in company with John Mander of Bakewell, Esquire. Or the tombstone of a woman from Brough-on-Noe in Derbyshire. According to John Wilson, quoted by Bateman in 1861, it was found in ploughing a field round about 1740 belonging to Mr. Morwood, Esquire of Alfreton, and was fixed in a wall opposite to a public house door there. I don't know where these things are. Some of the stones have behaved well enough to have been found under controlled circumstances and were delivered straight to a museum which has loved them. Most in my region, where there is no main museum, have either remained where they were found and been largely ignored, have gone wandering around Britain or in some cases around the continent. And this has meant visiting some unexpected places. From Ribchester, but now in Cheshire, there is this rather fine chap who is under the staircase of a convalescent home. When I went to visit it, I had to go on my hands and knees under the staircase, and when I kept coming out, I had to make reversing noises because there were people in electric wheelchairs thundering past, taking no notice at all. By the time we'd finished, the lady, the sister in charge, and myself were in absolute hysterics of laughter. Or a fell where we had to peel off the turf with special permission to get at this warrior. You see his head, his sword, his legs coming down here, and his friends. He's not on that rock by himself. There's about 7 of them. Or a garden in Penrith, famous for its alpine troughs. And here we have a Roman pineapple. As I went round, and she sort of drip-fed me these things, mostly talking about the plants, but I was particularly taken with one trough that had a hand coming out spookily out of the out of the gravel. Or the famous Tebay piggery, which I visited on the way down to the RAI outing to Anglesey. I'd been trying to get to see this for some years, but the piggery, which as you can see is a typical Cumbrian piggery, had what the farmer described as man-eating pigs in it. Apparently they bit, and she said she didn't really want to have anybody else in there except herself until I think she said that the pigs were relocated, which I took as a euphemism. But anyway, they were finally relocated, and in I went, and that's the stone I was after, that paler, creamy one there, because what's on it is a nice little Hercules with a lovely tummy roll there, and his hands up above his head, and that's there. Altogether, the catalogue reveals an interesting aspect of the religious and artistic life of the region. As mine is the last volume of CSR for Britain, I've been able to check out parallels across Britain as well as across the military zone, and have found some very interesting geographical groupings, which suggests that artistic practices didn't necessarily go east-west along the wall or the Staingate, but more often grouped north-south. And that observation is the only piece of analysis I'm going to give you tonight. My task has been to track sculpture down and catalogue it, and that has not always been easy, as you've realised. I now have a long list of topics to research in more depth, not least of which is the stone I started with on my title page at Brough Church in Cumbria. Is this Roman or is it medieval? And I leave that to you to puzzle over. Thank you.